welcome to Deal Nation. We're joined today by Steve Rawling, the owner of storiesthatwork.com, a master storyteller, a master salesman. Steve, great to have you on the show. How are you?
I'm great, Michael. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I first came across you and everything that you do in terms of your storyteller tactics on a podcast that you did with Brian Driscoll, who's a friend of the show. And I just really loved the idea of using really great storytelling tactics for real estate investment conversations. So, you and I, we've talked on a couple of occasions about real estate investment and how those conversations are structured, the empathetic nature of reaching out to sellers. So I wanted to just kind of get some insights from you for our audience on how they can apply your tactics to their business. But before we get there, let's
Yeah.
let's dive in a little bit. Give the listeners an introduction to you and your background.
Okay, thank you. Well, I was a journalist at the BBC for a long time, so working in TV, and it was very interesting when I went in there because I was really keen to do the job well. As you know, any time you start in any job, you're just hungry for any kind of tip or clue or hint as to how to do the job better. And I was very inexperienced, and I was looking around, and you'd watch people react to certain information as it came in, and sometimes people would get really excited about a story, and my job as a researcher was to prepare stories and go to the editor and say, what about this, what about this, what about this? And sometimes they'd be going, nah, that's boring, and other times they'd be going, oh, that's a great story. And I was thinking, okay, well, what's the difference? What am I getting wrong on that one, and what am I getting right on that one? And what is a story? And I was thinking, I'm too embarrassed to ask, because I should know this. But nobody actually, looking around, nobody actually seemed to know what it was that made some stories great and other stories boring. And if they did, they were very sort of blasé about it. So there was a horrible thing journalists would say, if it bleeds, it leads. Right? As in, if somebody's been injured or killed, that's your lead story. Well, it's just not true. No, it's just not true. That's not what makes a story good. But nobody really explained, and you gradually pick it up in any profession. You pick up how to do the job mainly by watching other people do it and listening to their stories and watching the reactions. That's why working remotely is a disaster for young people, because they can't watch old people like me and you do the job. So it's a disaster. So we watch other people, we copy other people, gradually we pick up the skills. And then, okay, after about 15 years of doing that as a journalist, I actually got asked to train other people in how to tell stories, and finally went, okay, well, I need to have a system, I need to have a plan, I need to have a structure. So I started looking at things like, the 12-stage hero's journey and all this kind of 3-act plays and 5-act plays. And for the first time I was going, oh, wow, that's really useful. I can see how that works. But then you realize actually that's far more information than most people need to tell a story. Most people don't need a 12-stage journey. And certainly in business, you don't need that. You don't need a kind of, a detailed journey through sometimes you just need two sentences. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that was my kind of epiphany was having to teach my own skills to other people for the first time, and then having to teach them in a kind of commercial setting when I left the BBC and became a consultant like I'm now, having to teach people skills they could use really quickly. Yeah, you don't want to spend 10 years learning to be a journalist. Yes,
Yeah.
you just want to tell a story now that works. And so that was the real kind of transformation, is going from rapid journalistic storytelling into practical business storytelling. And out of that, basically, yeah, all the different ways of telling stories, all the many years of experience, I've kind of condensed into something that I hopefully can teach fairly quickly. So yeah,
Well,
that
there's
was
so
that. So,
much there. Sorry to interrupt. There's so much correlation between journalism and sales and marketing. I remember in university I took a couple of journalism classes, And I remember and speaking of journalism adages, I loved the adage, don't bury the lead. And as a marketing director, I've used that consistently throughout the years, just like reviewing
Mhm.
an email, for instance, and just underlining something in paragraph 3 and saying, that's your lead. Don't bury
Yeah,
the lead. That
yeah,
needs to be at the top of the email
yeah,
because that's the
yeah,
message you want to get across. And when somebody sits down to read a novel, like that is an activity that they are doing in order to spend a fair amount of time, right? It's something
mm,
that they're purposely putting time into, and so their patience level with the development of a story is quite lengthy.
right,
Whereas when they pick up a newspaper or open an article online, you've got moments to capture their
mm,
attention sufficiently to get them to finish it, right? So,
absolutely right.
obviously, why crap headlines work, unfortunately, right? Is because you got their attention.
Well, there's the thing about clickbait, really bad clickbait headlines, and so the headline will be, you won't believe what XYZ looks like today, right? And some celebrity from the 1990s, you won't believe what blah, blah, blah looks like today, and I'm going, well, probably older than they looked like when I knew them. So, but you get drawn in, right? And it's frustrating because you then click on the headline and it's loads of junk and adverts, and finally gets to the bottom and it's not that good a story. The reveal is not that great. So, but
Right.
it works, right? And clickbait sadly works because it's doing a very particular thing that great storytellers do, and that is this: it's kind of opening up a gap in your knowledge of the world. Now, if I said to you right now, okay, how many things are there that you don't know? Well, the answer is billions. There's billions of things you don't know,
Yeah.
right? In the world today, is infinite number of things you don't know. So how do you deal with the infinite mass of your ignorance? Well, you just ignore it. So you don't pay attention to things you don't know by definition. Okay, so but we're curious creatures, and we like to, when we see a gap in. So basically, if you do something like, okay, if I were to ask you now, and the listeners and viewers now, okay, how old do you think my son is? And you'd be looking at me and going, "Ooh, Steve's probably in his 50s, so maybe he had kids when he was young. His son could be 30." Okay, you're trying to figure it out based on, how old I look and how tired I look. So you're trying to figure it out, and so you'll have a guess, and you'll guess whatever. Go on, have a guess. How old do you think my son is?
I
What do
guess
you reckon? Yeah,
19.
he's nearly 30 actually. So I had him when he was very young. But the point is, the correct answer to that question is we have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have no idea if you've got a son or not. We can't tell. But you don't do that. You just have a guess, and you have a guess based on all kinds of like prejudices and biases and shortcuts and whatever. Because we'd rather have a guess and get it wrong than say, I don't know, because that's the way our brains work. So clickbait and headlines and great storytellers are all doing the same thing. They're kind of opening up this kind of gap of opening a gap in your knowledge of the world, and in that gap you want to close it as quick as you can, and the only way to close it is to click on the link. So when you're thinking about writing for an email, for example, writing a headline on a blog post, writing on social media, how are you going to do that? How are you going to open up a gap in our knowledge? So a great way of doing it is ask a question. Okay. So you've got some information on, for example, the Fed are talking about changing the interest rates next month. You've got a bit of information and insight on what that's going to mean for home buyers. Right. Okay. So you've got expertise to offer here. Turn it into a question. What will you do if interest rates go up 0.5%? Well, until you asked the question, I wasn't thinking about that. Now you've asked the question, I'm thinking about it. You've opened up a gap in my knowledge, and you've added a bit of anxiety because I might be overextended on my debt. And now the only way I can close that gap is, well, first of all, I'll have a guess. What would I do? Now I'm curious. I'm going to close the gap by clicking on your email or post or whatever. So that's what we would call a story hook. It's hooking me in by opening a gap, and the only way I can close it. Yep. So storytellers are doing this all the time. Think about the story of Pandora, and the Greek mythology, the gods give Pandora a box, right? And they say, okay, here's a box, don't open it, right? And it's impossible. Of course, she's going to open it because
Yeah.
she's curious, and we are curious creatures. So it's a great device is ask a question, tell somebody that you've got a secret. Yeah. Tell
Yeah.
somebody that you've got kind of expertise, like you've got a life hack or a set of rules or anything that basically is opening that gap in their knowledge, and they're going to close it by listening to you. And that's a storyteller trick that goes down centuries.
Yeah, asking questions as a story hook is really effective in text message marketing, because
Mm,
you have, when you send a text, you usually have about 160 characters to hook them, right? And
yep.
so you don't have the space to educate. You don't have the space to build loyalty or to truly inspire off of a single text. What you're looking to do is to initiate a response, and for that response to get people into an engagement, and into get them to engage, so that you can
Yep.
engage with them via text, or better yet, push that to a phone call where you can truly start to tell them a story, and you can truly start to find out what motivates them, and all of that, right? But that
Yeah.
question equals response tactic, we've
Yep.
seen it. We have the data to back it up. It works very,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
well.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, all conversation is human, and stories are a conversational medium. And even if this conversation is happening on your, on your phone, it's still a conversation. And just as you wouldn't walk into a room and start lecturing somebody, right, start just
Yeah.
downloading information at them, or if you do, just watch what happens. Very quickly, they're like, oh, backing off, and the next thing you know, they're out the door. So the same applies to a conversation over a phone. You don't go in and start lecturing people. Great in a social networking situation, you ask you ask questions, you draw them out. Yeah, you draw information out from them, and actually then you kind of echo back. So fantastic way of doing it is you ask a question, you ask another question, and then what you're listening for as you're asking questions all the time is you're listening for some point of similarity. Oh, that reminds me of a time when I da 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 da, and then you're offering something back to match what they've offered you, and that's how good conversations work. And there's no reason why it should be any different on any platform. What doesn't work is going in all guns blazing. Unless, look, if you're in a sales pitch situation where it's a formalized setting where you've got a chance to make your pitch, well, kind of people understand the rules of the game. You're going to make a pitch, so you wouldn't walk into a pitch situation, and it would be quite high risk strategy to walk in and start asking a bunch of questions, because frankly you should know the answers to those questions before you get there. Yeah, you should have done your homework. But in a kind of first approach to somebody in a conversation, whatever platform it's on, yeah, ask questions.
Yeah.
People talk a lot about storytelling as being very important, and it is important, but actually story listening is is also really, really important. This idea that you're going to try and draw other people's story out of them. What matters to them? What are they worried about? What are they concerned about? What do they want to do next? What are they excited about? Well, you find that out by asking questions, and then what you're doing is you're kind of sorting in your head as they're talking and thinking, okay, well, that's like a time when I helped someone like you to do the thing you're trying to do. Okay, I've worked with someone like you before, I can help. And
Yeah,
so the
let's play off that a little bit, because
mm,
this is a delicate balance, and it can
mm,
be tough for people that are really learning to engage with sellers in the real estate investment business, which
yep,
is that there's a lot of information that they need to get from the seller, and they have a limited amount of time to do it. So there
mm,
can be a certain tendency at times to make it almost like a form fill with a face. What's your
mm,
motivation? When do you want to
mm,
move? And it's your checkboxing questions, and the person doesn't really feel engaged. So
mm,
how do you find the right balance between, asking those checkbox questions, and then being able to weave in experience related feedback? So, if someone says, for instance, the the bank is calling me 3 times a day. I really
Mm,
don't know
mm,
what I'm going to be able to do with
mm.
this house. And then the
Yep.
person says, look, this happened 2 weeks ago. I worked with this
Mm,
guy named
mm.
Steve, lives in your
Yep.
neighborhood. I'm not going to give you full details. It's his personal
Yeah,
information,
yeah.
but he was getting a lot of calls from the bank. So we
Mm,
gave him three different options. And these were for Steve, these were the options that worked. He ended up going with
mm,
option C. Here's what,
mm,
and get into like
mm.
the specifics of how they help Steve, as opposed
Yeah,
to just, we can do this, this, and this. Like, you understand what I mean? Like finding the right
yeah, yeah.
balance. So it doesn't.
And or even taking a step even further back from the hard sell. And so someone just told you that the bank's calling them 3 times a day because they're in difficulty. And well, even so, that must feel terrible. And inviting them, see. So what you're saying by that is, God, that must feel terrible, or is that making you feel really stressed? Where you're actually showing you've heard them and showing that you recognize that they are, feeling something pretty bad, or inviting them to share, and then okay, so you kind of got something personal out of them. You need to offer something personal back. Now it's either your own experience, which is all, so if you've experienced debt and the pressure of debt, well, okay, maybe that's the time to share that. Maybe not. Maybe the personal thing you're offering back is, I've helped someone like you in a similar situation. Like you said, this idea of, well, I met this guy 2 weeks ago and he was in a very similar position. So, but what you're doing effectively is you're kind of mirroring, I suppose a psychologist would say, but not sort of blow for blow, word for word. What you're doing is saying, you've just shared something with me that's quite vulnerable and personal. So I'm going to not just carry, okay, thank you very much, tick. Yeah. So let me give you a 10, tick, tick, tick. No, it's actually more than that. I've heard you. I'm checking with you that what I've heard is right. That I'm checking that that I'm getting your story right. By checking, that feels like something that would be really stressful. No, you wouldn't say this, but what you're doing is like, for me, that would be really stressful. Are you stressed? Yeah. So you're checking the story, checking, have I got your story straight? And what that signals to people, I think, is that you're listening. And the being listened to is really, really important. When I used to do one of the jobs as a journalist, and it was a pretty rough job, is you would turn up on somebody's doorstep, like banging on the door, if they had lost a relative in newsworthy circumstances. So, there's been a plane crash, whatever, and somebody's died, and you go and you knock on the door of the surviving family members and ask them if they'll do an interview. And it's pretty tough. And not surprisingly, you get a lot of doors slammed in your face. After doing this a lot, what I came to realize was there was something you could say to people that would make a big difference to whether or not they took you seriously. First thing you do is apologize, obviously, for intruding, but the next thing you say is really key. You've got about 5 seconds. And one thing that really helped for me was to say, look, I appreciate that you've gone through something awful. This is your chance to give your side of the story.
Mm.
Right. Because in a lot of cases, in these situations, particularly, people are going through some bad, tough times, people aren't listening to them. The people in authority often are not listening to them. They're not offering them any help. So to say, look, I'm a complete stranger and I've got a hotline to a million other complete strangers through this thing called TV. And actually they want to hear your story. That's very, very powerful. So that thing about being listened to, particularly when you're in, well, look, when you're in difficulty with debt, clearly that's a stressful time. But also if you're kind of, excited about opportunity, you've inherited a house from a relative that's passed away, and there's no problem. It's just, but equally, so you're excited about the opportunity, but you don't want to get stitched up or ripped off by somebody. So, that thing of, are you listening to me? Do you know what I really want? So signaling that you're listening, and some of that is about asking deeper questions about not just the mechanics and the finances, but how does it feel? Okay.
Yeah, you said a couple of things that I think are really
Mm,
important. So I want to loop back. We work a couple of the coaches, really prominent coaches that we work with in the real estate investment space, Steve Trang and Ian Ross over at
Mhm.
Close More Sales. They make this as part of their training, are asking these kind of emotional check-in questions and getting
Yeah.
people to actually respond to show that they're listening. And
Yep.
it's been really powerful in their programs. And you know, a big keyword or a big buzzword is empathy in the real estate
Mm.
investment industry. You have to be empathetic, but it can be really difficult, really easy, excuse me, to confuse empathy with just tone and saying
Mm.
something, for instance, like, "Oh, that's really tough. I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, look, here's what we can do for you."
Mm.
As
Mm.
opposed to saying, "Oh, that's tough. That are you feeling
Mm.
stressed? Like, how are you
Mm.
dealing with that? How are you
Mm.
holding
Mm.
up?" And then pausing and waiting
Mm.
for a response. And the
Yeah.
empathy comes not just in the tone, but in the fact that you took time to pause, wait, and listen.
Yeah.
So, I think that listening mechanism that you mentioned is really, really important to work
But
in.
it could also be like, okay, so you do have a, you've got a piece of paper, you've got, you're going down a form, and you sort of get to the bit where clearly it's got the emotional kind of impact, and you go, okay, put the form down. Put the form down. It's like that trick of going, taking the glasses off. Well, this is the real me now. So it's little
Yeah.
things like that of sort of, yeah, okay, just putting that away for one moment, and yeah, this is more than just a form. I appreciate it. Okay, so yeah, I can completely understand why they would say that. Um, from my point of view, when I'm obviously, I mean, I'm kind of not just dealing with sales. I'm dealing with all manner of different kind of storytelling, and the reason why I kind of look for those emotional points in a story is because they well, two reasons, three reasons. One is because emotion tends to stick in people's memories, and it's so when you've experienced a change that you weren't expecting, positive or negative, good or bad, you tend to feel emotion. So the stories often turn when a story turns one way or another. It's on the emotional kind of something happened that triggered emotion. It sticks in your memory. Okay, so but it also gets attention to if you're explaining a story and you start off by saying, I opened up her email and I just felt awful. Okay, right. There's something happened there. Yeah, where you've made a mistake or somebody's made, but there's something there that made you feel awful. That's a story moment that is quite hard to resist because what happened. Okay, or I walked in the room and she looked at me like, oh, so the emotions are really powerful indicators that something's happening in the story, and they're very closely linked to memory, and they're closely linked to attention. So when I'm tending to talk to people and I'm kind of trying to get the emotion out of people, because often otherwise people are trying to present information to you like it's a kind of timeline, yeah, where you're going to go from A to B, right? You're going to go from sort of A to B in a straight line, yeah. And it's, well, these are the steps you need to take. You're going to go da, 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 da. You're going to take these steps. You're going to get from A to B, and that could be a sales, house, the process of selling a house. But the reality is, as we all know, very few things go in a straight line, and when they do, we tend not to notice them. So you get up and you leave your desk and you walk to the front door, right? And the stairs and the floor don't collapse, right? Therefore, you don't notice them because why would you? Why? And you certainly don't tell a story about them because nothing
Right.
unusual happened, nothing unexpected happened, no story. So what the reality is that life is basically, yeah, we're trying to get from A to B, but we're much more interested in the kind of the roller coaster version of A to B, where things change from what we expected. And when you hit the roller coaster, you feel positive or negative emotion. Things going, oh, wow, I didn't believe that happened. It's great. Oh no. Oh, and that's the power in the story. That's what people remember. I mean, if you think
Mhm.
about really great teaching stories, when you're talking to to younger colleagues or people who are coming up on the investment scene, and you want them to remember a lesson that you've learned, you tell them about something you got really badly wrong. Yeah. And the moment you realized you really messed up and what you did to put it right, okay, that's a roller coaster. It's emotional and it's memorable. And that's the kind of story, again, I come back to why it is that young people suffered more during the lockdown than older people, is because they were missing out on those stories that people in our stage of our career can tell all sorts of stories about things we've messed up.
Yeah.
Yeah, people starting out in their careers, they haven't made enough mistakes yet, so they
No,
need
of
they
course.
need they need us to.
That vulnerability is it's important and an interesting kind of tactic. So
Mm,
again, like, a couple of things that I want to highlight
mm,
that you said is that the importance of, asking those kind of questions, those empathetic questions that show that you're listening, not just,
mm.
oh, that must be terrible, here's what you can do, but actually, like, or the question and response to say, well, is has this been stressful for you? Pause, wait.
Yeah, yeah.
That I think is a great tactic. Another one that you mentioned that I want to make sure that we highlight was when you
Mm,
were talking about going door to door, and you
yeah,
said, this is your chance to tell your side of the story.
yeah.
So in real estate investment, for our audience base, they're dealing exclusively really with properties that are in the distressed property market. And that, obviously, you and I discussed this, a couple times, but it means that they aren't going to be able to sell it the traditional route, right? They're not going to be able to hire a real estate agent,
Yep.
cash in on equity, make a bunch of money, move on to the next property. There's going to be some reason why they need to go a non-traditional route, and in most cases they don't have a full grasp of what all of those opportunities are. So
Mm,
being able to
mm,
come up with a way to basically stage that and saying, like, look, you own this property, this is your
mm,
property, nobody should be
mm.
telling you what to do with it. This is your opportunity to choose your own path, or your opportunity to choose what you want to do with it. And what I
Yep.
think that does, I think you'll agree, is if you go in and you just start pitching ideas, pitching
Mm,
solutions and asking questions, then they're on the back foot and they're going, well,
mm,
what does this person want? And
mm.
when is the end of this conversation going to hit? I have no guidance over the length of this conversation. I'm just
Yep.
basically sitting back and taking it.
Mm,
Whereas if you say, like, this is your opportunity to
mm,
choose your path, I'm just going to help lay out some options, then they can go, path A, no, not for me,
mm.
discard. Let's talk about path B. They can be a willing
Yeah,
participant in the length and course of that conversation, and
yep.
feel as an effect that they are really guiding rather
Yep.
than being led. And emotionally, that can make a very big difference in the final outcome of whether you're able to secure that deal or not.
I find it fascinating that you say that, from a sales perspective, because I think it's absolutely applicable from a storytelling perspective. And here's what so okay, so there's in story world there's the kind of there's so in your world you've got the home buyer, the home seller trying to realize a sale in difficult circumstances. In story world you've got the kind of the hero of the story. What they have in common, those two worlds, is, and this very fascinating you say this, what they have in common is agency. So people, I said people like to be listened to. It's absolutely true, but also, actually, most of us do not like to think of ourselves as passive or as kind of victims of. And it's very hard to tell a story about someone who's just a victim. Yeah, with it's very hard to do, with no kind of agency, no power, no control, no say, no nothing. It's a terrible story, actually. To be the only people who really are in that position are prisoners and babies. Yeah, the rest of us, adults and people, have got some kind of control. Now we may be so. In other words, we have decisions to make. Now we may be making those decisions in the worst possible circumstances, where everything is piling down on top of us, but doesn't mean we have no agency. We can choose to do maybe a very limited range of things. If you're heavily indebted, and you've got the bank on your back, and you're not you've got limited range of options, whereas Elon Musk has got, a billion options, right? So, okay, but you might
250 billion options or whatever it is
250
these
billion
days.
options, absolutely, yeah. Whereas not, but you've always got a choice, even if it's a terrible choice. But you might have a choice between bad or worse, but it's still a choice, and that gives you agency, right? Action. So the same in movie world. There is no movie ever made about someone with no choices. You just couldn't watch that film. It'd be like watching an amoeba, like you just couldn't watch it. Um, so that thing of, okay, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to say, poor old you, you've got no choice. You're powerless in this situation, because all that's going to do is make you resentful and angry. What I'm going to do is, okay, I'm listening to your circumstances. I hear what you're saying. Here's what I think your options are. Right.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. And what do you think of those options? Because actually, then you're putting the agency back on that person and saying, you have some control. Might not be ideal, might not be the choices you wanted. You might be up against some horrendous circumstances that are not your fault. I mean,
Yeah.
equally, it might be your fault. You might have been ignoring those letters from the bank and spending beyond your means, and you may have dug the hole that you're now in all by yourself. It doesn't really matter. The point is, in this conversation now, here are the choices you've got. And I think that's really interesting. You say that, because that's what we want to see in stories. We follow stories very, very closely and the key moment in the story is the moment of decision, where you've got, like, the path forks, and you go that way or you go that way. And that's what we look for in story, because that's what we look for in life. We know we've got choices, and if we're telling ourselves, "I've got no choice. I'm the victim here," it's a pretty depressing place to be. So even to offer someone in that situation, okay, I hear you're in trouble. I hear your difficulties. It must be awful. I get that. Here are what I think your choices are. Right. Yeah. That's basically making that person the hero of their story again.
Yeah. Okay. So I know I'm not taking a very linear track here, but I think this is all really great stuff. So,
Mm,
again, like recover, listening empathetically,
mhm,
creating agency, and making the seller
mm,
the hero of their own story. And
mm,
then the other thing that you mentioned a moment ago that I want to kind of go back to is showing vulnerability,
yeah.
admitting when you've made a mistake to
Mm,
show the potential path, because there's going to be options or times for in a real estate investment conversation when the homeowner really feels like they want to go down a particular path. If they want to
mm,
say, well, look, I know the house needs work. I'm not going to spend the money to do it, but I'm just going to list it anyway and
mhm,
see what happens.
yep.
And the investor is able to say, let me tell you about the second investment I ever made.
Mm,
I
mm,
bought a house. I was very early in my career. I didn't have time. I didn't have the money, excuse me, to really
mm,
put the 20, 30 grand that it needed to get fixed
mhm.
up, put on the market. And I just thought, you know what? I'm gonna do a light polish and see what I can get for it. And they tell
Yeah.
this whole story about in how in the end it took, 4 months of their time. They went back and forth with real estate agents. The equity in the house due to market fluctuations actually went down a little bit, not up. And if they had just gone back, they would have taken a different path, because the risk
Yep.
profile in the end wasn't really worth it. But they're basically saying in the
Mm,
beginning, look, I thought the exact same thing. I've
yep.
tried going down that path. It's logical,
Yeah.
it's smart, but here's what happened in my case. And they're
Mm,
telling a
mm,
story of failure, but in
mm,
a way that's going to get the person listening to go, okay, maybe you're right. Maybe that isn't the best option for me. Tell me about option C. And option C is actually the end point that the real estate investor wanted them to get to anyway. So they're
mm,
using that as an ability to guide the story where they want it to go, or the hero's journey where they want the hero's journey to
mm, yeah,
go,
yeah.
but giving
Yep.
them the elective choice to take themselves there by showing vulnerability at an important early stage.
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of, look, there are essentially, there are kind of two fundamental patterns to story: comedy and tragedy, as you know, the Greeks knew it. But there's stories that where you go, well, you've started out in a bad place and now so you started out down here and now you're in a better place. Yeah, so that's a happy ending. Or the other version is, well, you thought you were okay, but you've come crashing down. So there's like a sort of, you know, there's an exemplary story of, look, this is what we should do. In your situation, I do this because this works, right? That's a simple story. The flip side of it is, well, here's someone who tried the other approach and it failed. And either way, you kind of take it into a little microcosm of one individual did this, one individual did that. And yeah, I guess what's interesting when you tell a story about your own experience, so you can tell a story about several. You can do it two ways. You can tell a, for example, story, simplest form of storytelling, right? So you're trying to land a point, you're trying to make a point, for example, and you talk about either your own experience or another customer's experience, right? Okay, so that's a for example story. And when someone says, for example, I expect them to be telling me a factually accurate story about something in the past. Yeah, that's the deal,
Mm-hmm.
really. Okay. The alternative, though, is you can actually do the same story, which is a rising story or a falling story, but about the future. Works exactly the same. And you say, just imagine. Right. So when you say just imagine, right, you can then turn it into a story about another person in the past, or just imagine you in the future. So just imagine you do this and da 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 da. And actually, what's interesting about story is the structure of the story is the same. It's either rising or falling. There are little kind of movie moments along the way where something specific happens to someone. Structure is the same. But as I say, for example, tell me a factual thing about the past. Just imagine, tell me a plausible version of what might happen in the future. The great thing, as I say, about just imagine stories is you can use the second person pronoun, just imagine you. And it's almost impossible for anybody listening to go, no, I refuse to imagine that. I won't. They can't. You can't. And you
Yeah.
can put someone into a movie scenario, a story scenario, just with those three words. Just imagine you. Now, your responsibility, ethically, as a human being, is to be fair with that story. Don't do a just imagine story that's ridiculously optimistic. Yeah. Just imagine you win the lottery tomorrow and you can do anything you like. Well, you know that okay. But also don't tell them a story that's deliberately falsely scary and to try and scare them. And you know that's ethics. That's up to you as a human being who has to live with his conscience at night.
Yeah,
But
well, there's a very positive version of the Just Imagine story that fits very neatly within the real estate investment narrative because
hmm,
anyone that owns a distressed property, it is in some
hmm,
way, whether they're at the place in their evaluation, self-evaluation or situational evaluation where they're willing to admit that or not, it is in some way a shackle, right? It's
yep,
holding them back.
yep,
And so if you're able to use the Just Imagine to say, something as simple as imagine 3 weeks from now, you've got 130 grand in your pocket. You didn't have to do a single thing. You didn't even sweep out the garage and to get past this house. And with that money, now you're
mm,
looking at wide open. We talked about the options that you have here now in the moment. Imagine the options that you have with 130 grand in your pocket and nothing left to deal with this house, and you're
yep,
able to get them. Just you don't need to know what their perfect future is. You just
mm,
need to set the stage for them to
mm,
be thinking
mm,
in that direction and for you to be the person that helped facilitate
yep.
that.
Yeah, and then I think the next stage in that story is to, as you know, so you kind of, when I'm listening to potential clients talking to me about their storytelling needs, and I'm kind of I ask questions, trying to tease out from them what is it they need. Do they need selling stories? Do they need team building? Do they need brand building? Do they need culture forming stories? What is it they're trying to do? Are they academics who are trying to explain difficult research to non-expert audiences? So I'm kind of fishing for information from them. And what I'm doing, I'm kind of doing a sorting system in my head as I'm doing it of, okay, this reminds me of a time when I did this, and this. And so I'm kind of listening and push and then selecting, okay, okay. Well, 3 months ago, I was doing with this pharmaceutical company. So I'm kind of, and you can, that's basically what you're offering in effect is a form of social proof of saying, look, I've heard you, and I think your problem is kind of here-ish, and I've helped someone with a problem like that over here. And what you're doing really is you're trying to sort of locate your customer here, and then you're trying to find a story and bring it in that's as close to your customer's experience as you can make it. And clearly, that's a kind of advantage of working in a team. If you're working in a team of sellers and or investors, beg your pardon. If you're working in a team of investors and you are actively sharing stories with each other, so deliberately sharing case studies, then you can say, okay, I get it. You've got a distressed house. You've inherited from your mum. All these other pressures. It kind of reminds me of someone who I dealt with. That's great, but also it kind of reminds me of somebody one of my colleagues dealt with. Doesn't matter. Yeah, whether it's this is your customer case study or one of your colleagues, doesn't really matter. The point is, you're saying, I think I've got your story. I think I know where you are, and here's what happened to someone like you. That someone like you is really, really powerful, and it's and it's incredibly. It can be a very elastic. This concept of someone like you can be incredibly elastic and can sort of encompass a huge range of people. So someone like you could be someone down your street. It could be someone in your state. It could be someone, yeah, of your age. It could be someone of your background. It could be someone in your position. Someone that like you category can really stretch in lots of different ways. Yeah, and that's a kind of bit
No,
of
it's that's why
creative.
community is so. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
That's why community is so important in the real estate investment industry. Is if someone is a new real estate investor,
Mm,
and say someone's a new real estate investor and they're investing in a small town in the San Francisco Bay Area or a suburb of the San Francisco Bay Area. What they're
mm,
going through is very similar to what an investor just outside of Atlanta or just outside of Tampa is going through because
yeah,
they're in the same stage of building up their scaling up their business and
yeah,
really learning the ropes. And so being able to find people that are in similar situations as them and so that
mm,
they can confer or
mm,
find mentors that have been where they are so they can, as you said at the beginning top of the show,
yeah,
learn from those mentors, observe, see what they do, and kind of
yeah,
get their own
yeah,
sort of cadence. It's
yeah,
all really, really important.
yeah, yeah.
In terms of like what you were saying about the the storytelling side of, you
Mm,
know, a few things that we talked about, right? We talked about the being vulnerable, we talked about
mm,
empathy, we talked about
mhm,
letting them choose their own path, we
yep,
talked about they setting the future, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um, in real estate investment businesses, there are solo entrepreneurs, and there
yes,
are certainly entrepreneurs that can come in and really get nuanced and treat every situation as a new opportunity to tell a story, to weave in different example stories.
mhm,
Um, but in general, most people are aiming to build up either a small, medium, or large team of people.
mm,
And
mm,
the sellers that are coming in have a huge amount in common, right? They're
yep,
all in that distressed situation. Now, they may have inherited a property. They
mhm,
may be a multi-property landlord who kind of bit off more than they can chew. They might
mhm,
be someone who's a bit older. Their house is almost paid off, but they're not
yep,
doing, great financially and don't have the money to put into the house. there are different personal situations that need to be listened for,
Yep.
and can be somewhat extrapolated from the data. But there's
Hmm.
also this huge baseline of distressed property owner,
Mm.
can't
Hmm.
go traditional route, needs to
Hmm.
be guided down different paths, right?
Yep.
So what they're going to be looking for is the ability to script. So is there an
Mm.
ability to sort of script this in where, for instance, you go step one, listen and show empathy. When you
Mm.
get to path A, use a I made a mistake once story. When
Mm.
you get to
Mm.
path B and C, use recent success stories,
Mm. Mm.
and at some point between B and C, interject a future imagine if story. Like, is there a cadence that can be scripted, or is it truly just a listen, nuanced experience?
Well, the honest answer to that is I don't really know. I haven't. I've never tried a sales script of my own, so I've never used one when I'm talking to clients. Um, I've never written one for somebody else. I get exactly where you're coming from. I can see the advantage of that, particularly for new people coming in. Um, and yeah, I don't know. I mean, I know that my own conversations in a similar situation go much more on feel, but then I'm old and I've had lots of conversations, so I kind of, where you kind of build up your ability to feel your way through a conversation with experience. It's a really interesting challenge. I hadn't, would I turn around and be able to flesh out? I guess what you're trying to do with expertise is it's okay. Expertise lives in you. It comes out in stories, and anecdotes. So when you get through, when you get a bunch of investors together, right? They will just tell stories all the time. They'll be telling stories about nightmare houses and nightmare buyers and nightmare sellers, right?
Yeah.
So they'll tell these kind of dramatic stories because those are the ones that give them kudos as storytellers. Um, so there's probably a way of approaching those conversations if you've had enough of them. So if you've had 1,000 conversations with different types of distressed sellers, you are probably at the stage now where, with a little bit of help, and a little bit of kind of guidance, you could create that script, um, because you've done it so many times, and you've fallen off the script so many times, and you've embarrassed yourself, and you've recovered from bad, disastrous content. So yeah, you could probably do that. Um, if so, if I were trying to do that now, then what I would do is I'd sit down with someone like you who's had 1,000 conversations. Yes, and we would run backwards and forwards in a conversation, and we'd come up with, you've already come up with actually something which sounds like a kind of almost like a flow chart that you could flow through. Yeah, between us, we'd find, I think, that kind of script sounds too linear. Flowchart I
Right.
like more often. Like, well, okay, it does it, and the thing with the flowchart, does it feel like the conversation's going that way, or does it feel like it's going that way? Because it is actually about a feeling. um, and yeah, I can see how that's doable, that's creatable. I've never done one myself, but I can see how you'd make one. But it has to come from, um, it comes from someone who's had a lot of conversations, over many many years.
Yeah, I think that I like the idea of a flow chart versus a script, because it does you need to be able to be somewhat situational about it. But I could certainly envision a company being able to have story buckets, essentially.
Mm, mm.
And you could have within, you have your I succeeded through failure bucket. And you've just got a few anecdotal kind of stories in
Yep,
that succeeded through failure bucket. And then
yep.
you've got the of my recent success bucket. It doesn't matter how recent they are, it just needs to
Mm.
feel recent, right?
Well,
Or a
does it?
resident or locally successful. Fill
Yeah,
that bucket with a handful of stories, 3 or 4 stories,
yeah,
doesn't need to be
yeah,
50. And
yeah.
then
Well,
and imagine the future scenario bucket, right?
mm. But the interesting thing here is, I mean, this is so when you're like, so I work by myself as a sole, consultant and trainer. an author. I'm working by myself. So all of my story, all my bucket is here. But if you, as soon as you start bringing other people into an organization and to a team and start building a team, then that's no longer enough. And therefore, so I refer to it as a story bank, but it's a very similar idea. It's basically, okay, you need to write your stories down somewhere. Once you go beyond being a sole practitioner like me, you have to write them down. And even I have to write them down, because otherwise I can't find them when I need them. So I keep a simple spreadsheet with it's got about 300 stories on it, and they relate to my training work. So if I'm teaching somebody how to use a storyteller tactic called movie time, which is one of the cards in the storyteller tactics box, so I'll say, okay, I've got this tactic called movie time. I'm going to give you a for example story of how I've used it. And I'll go to my story bank and I've got them tagged. So I've got all these stories and lists, right? But I've written tags on the stories. So I can just search movie time, and every story with a movie time tag comes up in the database. So if you're running a team of investors, you're running a team of people going out and meeting sellers, when you bring them together socially, right? You go for coffee, you go for beer, whatever it is, you come together in a social space, they will basically gossip, usually about nightmare customers or nightmare investors.
Yeah.
Okay, they'll gossip about all that sort of stuff. They're basically telling stories, but the thing is, no one's writing them down, because why would you? So the interesting thing, and also the fascinating thing, is the people with 1,000 interviews worth of experience, with 1,000 successful stories, they don't need to tell the story anymore, because they've embodied all that wisdom and they've got it. They've completely got it. Whereas the 25-year-old straight out of university who's got 2 sales and that's it, is desperately hungry for those stories. So what I've suggested with some companies I work with is, okay, the people with the most stories have the least incentive to write them down, because they don't need to. They know them already. The people with the fewest stories have the most incentive to so buddy them up. Buddy up a really experienced member of your team with somebody very inexperienced, and the experienced person talks while the inexperienced person writes.
Yeah.
And so the legwork of creating the story bank belongs to the people in the team with the least experience. And they've got the most to gain from it. But the cumulative effect, if you do that over a period of years, is just phenomenal. There's a great book, can't remember, Margaret Heffernan wrote it. I can't remember the title, but it's about culture in the workplace. And she was talking about an American vineyard. I can't remember, one of the Californian vineyards. And they had a practice of writing down every time somebody made a mistake in the company. They had to write it in a book, and the book sat on reception. So anyone in the company could go in and open the book and read it. And it was everything from, I dropped a crate of wine bottles in the warehouse and smashed them,
Yeah.
to the finance director made a wrong investment on currency and lost 100 grand. Right. And so it's every single mistake got written down. And what that means, well, first of all, it sends out a really powerful message about the culture of your company, that we don't hide mistakes, we learn from them. First thing.
Yeah.
Second thing, imagine you're a new accountant, or a new warehouse manager, or a new marketing, and you've joined that company. What are you going to do? You're going to go and read the book,
Yeah.
because you don't want to make those mistakes. So the same
Yeah.
goes for stories. Basically, but when you move beyond being a single, especially when you move to, if you're like, okay, you go from being a sole operator to having a team of 3 people around you, and you see them every day. Well, there'll be enough natural storytelling in that. Yeah. Okay, you'll be all right. But when you move from like a team of 3 people to you've got a team of 25 and they're spread over 10 different sites, and you only see them once every, I don't know, nowadays we don't see people that often. You only see them once every 6 months. Well, there's very little natural storytelling happening. You have to be deliberate about it. And the idea of a story bank Okay, so what's the story? Why would you tell this story? Like, it's a triumph through adversity. It's a recovery from disaster, whatever. Okay, where did it come from? Really important, because you don't want to take credit for somebody else's story. That's terrible. You don't want to repeat someone else's story back to them like it's your story. That's a disaster. Okay, is there anyone I shouldn't tell this story to? That's also recipe for disaster, getting that one wrong. Where have I already used this story? So you can't, imagine you're going in for a second meeting with someone, yeah, and you tell them the same story twice. Well, that's just rubbish. So they're just thinking,
Yeah.
well, you've not been listening to me. So all these things are, when you're getting your organization bigger and bigger, you need to be quite deliberate about it and think, we've got, for every customer you've ever dealt with, there's at least one story. For every colleague who you work with who's built up expertise, there's a dozen stories. So in a sizable team, if you've got 50 people working for you and you've dealt with 2,000 customers, you've got a lot of stories. Yeah.
So I do want to clarify this though, because
Mm,
it's, the ability to tell a story that is not your own. I
mhm.
understand not passing off someone else's story
Yes.
as your own, but can you do some variation of this? Like the homeowner says, I have this probate property, I want to do this with it. And my response as the investor is, you know what? That was my exact thought. I
Mhm,
thought that going in, but I was
mhm,
recently talking to Steve Rawling. He's a mentor of mine. He's worked
mm,
with 200 plus homeowners in the
mm,
area, and
mhm,
and he's had a handful of these cases. This is what he told me.
mm. Yep.
You
Okay,
know, like,
fantastic. Because if you think
okay,
about what are you doing there? So we talk about social proof as being, when we're not sure what to do, we look at other people. So we learn from other people all the time. Okay, so what you're doing in that little scenario, okay, you've got two choices. You're thinking, well, okay, this person just said she wants to do X, Y, and Z, and I don't think that's a good idea. And I'm going to tell her a story about X, Y, Z led to this outcome. So I'm either going to pretend I did it and or I'm going to credit where the story came from. So pretending you did it is a terrible idea because you start down the lie and you have to keep telling the lie. And she comes back with a question and you go, oh, shit, I don't know because I'm lying. I have no idea. So you're in trouble straight away. And it's a terrible thing to do. Whereas the honest approach, which is, okay, I've never dealt with this before, but my mentor, he's done this 10 times, and he told, well, what you're doing is you're demonstrating that you're part of a network of people who trust you, right?
yeah,
So what the subliminal message here is, other people trust me, therefore you can trust me. I've got a mentor, therefore I can't be a psychopath. Yes, I'm not. Yeah, because you can't be
no, yeah,
because psychopaths can't hold down long term relationships with anybody in any situation. Whereas you're saying, look,
yeah,
I've got this guy who's been mentoring me for the last 10 years. Um, well, straight away, the subtext of that is because I'm not an asshole. I'm actually somebody he's worth having a relationship with.
sure.
So yeah, so look, there's absolutely no drawback that I can see with you saying this hasn't happened to me, but it's happened to someone I trust. And his advice would be this. What's the customer going to turn around? She's going to turn around and say, well, I don't care what you think. Give me the phone number for
Yeah,
this guy. Not
right.
going to happen, is it?
No, it's not.
So yeah, it's look, honesty is almost always the best, best policy. I can't, there are not many occasions where honesty is not the right way of doing it.
Right.
And so, a bit of humility as well. No, I haven't dealt I haven't dealt with a case like yours before, but I know someone who has. Fantastic.
Hmm.
Or even if you're absolutely stumped, and again, early in your career, this might happen. Would it be, all right? So best. I haven't dealt with a case like this. I know who to ask would be far better than secretly thinking, God, I have no idea what to say here. I'm just going to wing it. Hmm. But yeah,
Yeah.
so but demonstrating that you have listened to other people's stories, again, is that thing of I'm someone who listens, I'm someone who could be trusted, I'm someone who develops relationships over time. The subtext always with stories, when you're talking about negotiating or selling or leading, the subtext is always, you can trust me.
Yeah.
You can trust me to do
But
the
it's
right thing.
important that they use the word subtext, right? You're not saying you can trust me. You're proving or showing.
No,
Show, don't
because
tell.
only psychopaths go around saying, you can trust me, honestly, trust me. Like
Yeah.
it's like
No,
it's ringing alarm bells to say, oh, I'm really trustworthy.
right.
Yeah, I figured you were. I've let you in my house. So it's a yeah,
Right.
uh, yeah.
All right. So we've gone over some really, really important tactics, and
Mm,
I'm going to put a recap of this into the episode
mm,
description. So
mhm,
for anyone that's listening, if you want us to get back together, bring Steve back on to talk
mm,
about empathetic listening, to talk about how to tell a story of success through failure, to talk about how to create agency and make people the hero of their own story, to talk about how to weave in those kind of success stories, either your own or those that are within your network, and just how to kind of use vulnerability, honesty, and listening in building out stories and creating story banks for your business. We'll put kind of all of this in the recap. But in the meantime, Steve, if people do want to work with you and bring you on to kind of
mm,
analyze how what their teams are saying and how they're currently
mm.
using stories or creating a story bank, what's the process?
Okay, easiest way to find me is LinkedIn, or just Google search on Steve Rawling and Storyteller Tactics. That'll pull me up. My website's called storiesthatwork.com. So stories-that-work.com. Thank you. And there's some examples, as you'd expect, some little stories of people I've worked with, and lots of kind of pointers towards kind of resources we use. And yeah, a chance to send me an email. But again, come and find me on LinkedIn, and start a chat. And yeah, tell me what your story needs are, and I'll ask you all sorts of empathetic questions, and then share an example of a previous customer I've worked with, because that's what we do.
All right. All right. Well, thanks, Steve. I really appreciate it. I think that's some great actionable insights
Mm,
for real estate investors to really start leveraging storytelling in their
mm.
sales processes. So really great stuff. Appreciate you coming on. Thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure, Michael. Real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. And something to stick in the notes as well. I'll send you a link. I did a case study with Brian. You mentioned Brian Driscoll at the very
Yeah.
beginning, a friend of the podcast. I did a before and after case study with Brian, where he came to me with the kind of videos he was making, and we worked for about 6 weeks on the ins and outs, the story mechanics of what sort of story was he really telling and how was he telling it. And then we've got a before and after of what you can do when you really sit down and work on your story. So I'll send you a link to that, and if you wouldn't mind sticking that in the show notes, because I think
Yeah,
it'll
absolutely.
demonstrate for people in a really simple way just how effective this stuff can be.
Perfect. Sounds great. All right,
Okay.
Steve. Thank you, sir.
Cheers, Michael. Nice to meet you.